12:59. So we'll join, let a few other folks join, and then we'll begin. So I see that we now have 18 folks joining us, and so welcome to all of those folks who are on the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council. This today is primarily an informational meeting, and then welcome to all of you who are guests who are not part of the CJCC. I wanted to let all of you know that this meeting is being recorded. You might see in the top of your screen a little icon that says recording. Certainly I want to let all of you know that the meeting is being recorded. If you're uncomfortable speaking, there's certainly ways to raise your hand and offer a chat if you would prefer to do that more privately and not publicly. But with that, I think hopefully all the rest of you are somewhat familiar with the Zoom platform. Today we're fortunate to have folks with us that have been doing some thorough analysis of our jail data, and they have some results that I think will be very helpful for all of us to hear. These presentations today, as I indicated, are really intended to be information and to help guide the CJCC to further decision making. If you have thoughts or suggestions, please feel free to offer them. However, it's our hope that today we actually get information, we can digest the information, and then do some planning. And so since we have some new participants joining, now 24, I just wanted to remind folks that this meeting is being recorded and that we're going to hear from two folks who are assisting the CJCC with data collection and analysis. So those individuals are Tom Eberly. He's a program manager for the Justice Management Institute, which is part of the MacArthur Foundation Safety and Justice Challenge. He's a consultant to the Missoula Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, and his work is provided through the grant that we've received from the Safety and Justice Challenge. He's been working in criminal justice for over 20 years and is primarily been working in Mecklenburg County in North Carolina. Quinn Ziegler is closer to home. He's part of a new division with Missoula County, and it is newly named the Criminal Justice Services Division, and he is our data analyst. Quinn's been working in criminal justice and justice data analysis for several years after finishing his master's in public administration at the University of Washington. And so I know that both Tom and Quinn have a lot of information to present. And you can see in the corner as well, Kristen Jordan, who's our coordinator for CJCC, and many of our CJCC members, but I'm not going to waste our time to go through everyone. We will keep a record of all the attendees. And again, if you have questions, I would ask now that you mute yourself so we don't have any interruptions for Quinn and for Tom. But if you have questions, please feel free to raise your hand, and we'll try to make sure that we have time to address questions once the presentations are done. And certainly Quinn and Tom can kind of offer their suggestions about how best to manage their presentation and ask questions. So Quinn, why don't you begin? And you can just give us perhaps a brief update about your background if I've missed anything, and then what work you've done and what results you might have.
Yeah, thanks. So hi, everyone. My name is Quinn Ziegler. I'm the data analyst for the CJCC. What I want to sort of be talking about today is some growth in our jail population that we've been experiencing over the past couple months. So for those of you that are aware and familiar, the CJCC department maintains a jail dashboard for the Missoula County Detention Facility on our county website. If you had a chance to take a look at that recently, you've probably noticed that really for the past couple months, we've sort of had a steady increase in our daily jail population. And so today, I sort of want to talk about what we think is happening to drive that growth, and then have a larger conversation about where we might be able to head moving forward. So with that said, I'm going to share my screen here. Right. Okay. And I'm also, okay. So I have a couple slides that I'm going to walk folks through. If you have questions as we go along, I just ask that you please hold those to the end, and then I'm happy to answer those to the best of my ability. So with that, we'll get rolling. So the first graphic that I sort of wanted to focus on is just a chart of our daily population at the detention facility from January 1st of this year through June 30th. So you can see that for sort of the first 3 months or so, we're sort of where we typically are with our jail population, between about 180 and 200 inmates per day. And I do want to note that this is specifically focused on inmates who are under the county's jurisdiction. So this does not include folks who are housed at the detention facility who are either there as the result of a federal hold or folks who are in the mask program. So you can see that we're between our 180 and sort of 200, which is where we typically sit, until March 17th. Beginning March 17th, we see a really precipitous drop off from about 182 inmates down to 97 inmates on April 2nd. So this drop off coincided with sort of responses to COVID, both motions filed by defendants for release due to some health concerns and being in the facility, as well as a new admissions policy implemented by the jail that barred anyone charged with either a misdemeanor or a failure to appear where the underlying, a misdemeanor that was nonviolent, or a failure to appear where the underlying charge was also a nonviolent misdemeanor. So sort of during those last 2 weeks of March, sort of right when COVID was starting to hit, we saw a really precipitous drop off in our jail population. And right sort of at the start of April is when we hit our low point. So April 2nd, we hit our low point of 97 inmates on that day. And then those first 2 weeks of April, we were relatively stable, floating sort of right around 100 inmates per day. After those first 2 weeks of April, what we saw is right around April 17th, we sort of saw this steady, almost linear increase in our daily jail population. And we climbed to ultimately a high of 147 individuals on June 29th. So the second to last day of the period that we're looking at, and we only fell to, I believe, 145 inmates by June 30th. So if we're looking at who is in jail, what's the reason for their hold, we can see that the trend in our overall population is mirrored by the trend in our either district court hold or felony population. Now, one note on this data is that the data above here is collected daily, whereas the data in the chart below is collected weekly. So this is just going to appear a little bit smoother than the chart above. But I think what you'll see is that the trends in our district court felony population really mirror what we're seeing here above. Now, that's different than, say, folks who are in there for a DOC, Department of Corrections hold, who aren't facing any other local charges. We see that despite COVID, that population remains relatively stable during this period. You know, we also saw a bit of a drop off in our municipal court hold population. And we've seen some rebounds sort of in the last half of May and then through June. Though, as you can see, this constitutes a relatively small share of our overall jail population. The other holds that we keep track of are our justice court holds. So that refers to folks who have a justice court case for a misdemeanor. Those always sort of constitute a really low share of our jail population, and that remains to be true. The last category that I'll talk about is sort of this other population, which is sort of a catch-all for folks, say, on an extra jurisdictional warrant, so being held for another county or perhaps on a fugitive charge. It also includes folks who are on a commitment from either municipal or justice court, as well as folks who might have sort of multiple holds going on. For example, someone with a parole violation who's under the jurisdiction of the DOC, as well as folks also have charges, say, in district court and are being held on bond. So we've seen a sort of a slight increase in that population as well. But again, I just want to emphasize that the municipal and sort of other hold categories are really a small percentage of our jail population. So when we're talking about growth, I think we really need to be focusing on our district court and felony population. So moving to the next slide, I want to start by focusing on the daily felony population. So this is the same chart as the one in the slide before, except the difference is it zooms in on our period of growth. So between April 1st and June 30th of this year. And then it compares what our growth looked like to this same time period last year. So you can see that between April 1st and June 30th, we're largely sort of mirroring the trends that we saw in this same time period in 2019, though the volume of inmates that we're seeing is certainly lower. And now that's for the overall population, including both pretrial and sentence inmates. When we focused on pretrial folks, we can see that the trend is a bit different. Starting on April 1st here, there's a gap of 56 inmates between what our population that we saw in 2019 versus what we saw in 2020. By the time we get to June 30th, that gap has shrunk to only 15. So the rate of growth per se in our pretrial population is quite a bit steeper than what we saw in 2019. Now, if we look at our sentenced population, sort of the opposite is true. Although I do want to make sure that folks saw, as I changed the population, this axis on the left-hand side changed. The vast majority of our population on any given day at the detention center is primarily pretrial. For sentenced folks, for 2020, we are sitting between 25 and 30 folks at the detention center on a sentenced status. That's relatively stable for much of the time period we're looking at until sort of the last 10, 11 days of June, when it drops off to about 13. Now, I think when we're talking about this population, the important thing is that although we have less folks in the detention center, the rate of growth is paralleling what we saw in 2019 and actually steeper if we're just focusing on the pretrial population. The next thing I want to focus on is looking at what's happening with the length of stay. We see that for much of this period, the length of stay is significantly higher in 2020 than it was in 2019 for our felony population. 2020, we're talking approximately 108 days on average for this time period, where it was only 83 days in 2019. I think this increase is attributable to a couple things. One is certainly what we call the hardening of the jail population. So the jail population is composed now of sort of more serious offenses than it would be under normal circumstances. The second thing to be aware of is due to concerns over COVID, just experiencing court delays and delays in jury trials, and really figuring out how to navigate that. We saw folks certainly have continuances in their court cases and moving through their court cases a bit slower during this period, which certainly also may be contributing to this big disparity in the length of stay between those 2 years. Towards the end of this period, you can see the length of stay sort of drops off again quickly back to 2019 levels. I think this is both sort of attributable to that drop in the sentence population that I talked about, as well as an increase in new admissions coming into the jail, which new admissions by nature are going to have a shorter length of stay. They just showed up at jail, so mathematically that is of course going to bring our average down. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is looking at what is the percentage of our felony population, say, that was here today, that was also incarcerated under that same booking 30 days ago. Um, on average, we saw that in 2020, 72% of our felony population that is here today was there 30 days ago. In 2019, that was only about 57%. Now, again, over this time period, we can see that number trend downwards as we move closer to June 30th. Again, I think this is just reflecting that increase in admissions that we talk about that's bringing that percentage down. So if we look at just the raw number of folks who were incarcerated a month ago, back to this top visual here, we see that for the most part through April and a good part of May, we're sort of on pace with what we saw in 2020. But as we move forward, we see it diverge where we are sort of floating around 80, 75, 80 folks for the most part for this time period in 2020. Certainly lower than what we saw in 2019 over this same time period, especially as we get into June. However, the difference is that if we look at the confined population average length of stay, it is significantly higher for much of this time period than it was in 2019. We're talking 2 weeks to about a month longer. So the takeaway point here is that although we have less people who have been staying, or less people in jail, the folks that are there, at least some portion of that population, they're staying longer than they typically do. And that's certainly going to contribute to some of the growth that we're seeing. If we look at sort of what's happening overall in district court, just sort of a simple look at how many cases are being filed versus disposed. So I want to note first that this does not include cases where cases that were either a filing for a revocation of a suspended or a deferred sentence, or cases with a revocation that were disposed. That was unfortunately just a limitation in the data. But if we look at sort of what's happening with new charges that are being filed, we can see that in 2020, we're certainly disposing more cases than were filed through March. And then sort of as COVID hit, we see that cases disposed certainly dropped off as the number of cases filed continued to increase. Typically, we're seeing about 20 more cases filed per month than are being disposed. Relative to 2019, this is quite a bit different, where for much of this time period, the court was actually disposing more cases than it was seeing coming in. So taken together, these data points are sort of pointing to the existence of a population in our detention facility that has become more stagnant and is experiencing slower turnover. So the next part of this equation that I've sort of alluded to already that I want to talk about is what's happening with admissions. On the top chart here, we have felony admissions or felony bookings for a rolling 7-day average over this time period that we've been talking about, April 1st through June 30th. We can see that over this time period, we've really experienced an increase in admissions relative to what we typically see for our felony population in 2019, and we're really coming back to meet those 2019 levels. If we look below, I do a comparison of what's happening with admissions relative to releases between these two time periods. We can see that in 2020, felony bookings exceeded releases for much of this time period. So the important line here is the 0 line. Anytime we're above 0, that's indicating days where the rolling average of bookings exceeded the rolling average of releases. So periods where we're going to experience some growth. And we can see that difference between booking and releases for this time period overall trended upward during this sort of 3-month window. Relative to 2019, we see the opposite trend. We see overtime releases actually sort of winning out over bookings as we move into June. So in combination, right, you have this stagnant population that's not moving as quickly as they typically do. In addition to new admissions, together they sort of create a perfect storm for some of the growth that we're seeing. Now, the last slide that I want to focus on is talking a little bit, well, what kind of charges are we seeing? Are there particular types of offenses or types of statuses that folks are coming in on that may be behind some of this growth that may be similar or different to what we saw in 2019? So certainly when I talked about the hardening of the jail population, I want to acknowledge that the jail, certainly in the face of COVID, is we see an effort, perhaps reserving that space for more serious or violent offenses. We see in 2019, in quarter two of 2019, so again, April through June, about a little over 12% of our population was in there for a violent offense. We see that's jumped up to 26% this year. We've also seen increases in drug crimes, or I should say admissions for drug-related charges, as well as traffic-related charges. When we're talking about felony traffic-related charges, we're really talking about felony DUI. We've seen a slight increase in property as well, though that is over this time period continuing to trend downward. Where we sort of saw the decreases are in folks who were being admitted specifically for probation violations, and then as well as this sort of miscellaneous category, which includes things such as pre-release violations or failure to register as a sexual or violent offender, extrajurisdictional warrants, fugitives, things of that nature. Now, I think sort of one of the interesting things is that through this period, warrants historically constitute a large share of our bookings, and that certainly has remained true in the face of COVID. Up here, I focus specifically on district court arrest and bench warrants issued over this time. So we can see that for really a lot of 2020 thus far, we are below 2019 levels, really until we get to May and June, when we see the number of warrants issued sort of take off. I think this coincides with the court starting to open back up a bit, having folks, hopefully appearing for their cases and trying to process those. But certainly what might come with that is folks are not compliant, and the court feels the need to issue a warrant, they may need to do so. But certainly we're seeing that sort of translate into some growth into our jail population as well. So, moving forward, I just want to note that, Missoula County, we're part of the Safety and Justice Challenge, so we have some sort of comparison data to other jurisdictions. So unfortunately, the most recent data that was available was only from April and May of this year. But for what we report to the Safety and Justice Challenge, our daily population increased by 14%. It was one of only 4 sites out of 26 to experience growth at or above 5%. And we were the only site to experience double-digit growth during this time. Now, certainly Missoula is a little unique. We are, I believe, the smallest jurisdiction in the SJC Challenge at this point. But among sort of other smaller sites participating, I define that as jurisdictions with a jail population baseline at or below 400 inmates. We actually tied Buncombe County, North Carolina, for the largest increase in its ADP during this period in terms of just pure number of people added. That's 15 inmates per day. Though, again, important context, Buncombe County has a jail population that is typically twice that of Missoula, just for some context. Um, and so I know also this ends at June 30th. So what is happening in July? Some preliminary look at the numbers suggests that for the first 2 weeks of July, we did continue to see sort of this growth, and we actually reached our high of 150 inmates, the highest we've reached yet since beginning of April on July 13th. Since then, we've sort of been sitting in that mid 140s range. So there does appear to be some sort of stabilization happening, which is certainly good news. But just some things to be aware of, certainly in the context of what we're experiencing public health wise. The COVID situation across the nation and Montana continues to get worse. And certainly as admissions increase and we have more folks cycling in and out of the jail, that certainly increases the exposure risk for both inmates and staff. So sort of as we look forward into what is the next step for the CJCC and Missoula County, I'd encourage us to think about what we can do differently and how we might be able to make sure that our jail population remains manageable, certainly in the face of this public health crisis. So with that said, certainly happy to open it up for questions and comments if folks have any before we turn it over to Tom.
So if you have a question, if you wouldn't mind raising your hand or just chiming in, I guess, if no one else is speaking. So Quinn, I just had this is Judge Halligan. I had a question with regard to your chart, and it may have been perhaps the second page or so. You listed Justice Court, Municipal Court, Other, and District Court. On that. Effectively, each of those lines represents a portion of the population, and so to get at our total population, you'd be adding all of those lines together, not
That's correct, with the one caveat that you certainly have some people who come in and are released prior to when this data is collected. So for those folks, we don't establish a hold. They were essentially in and out in less than 24 hours. So if you were to add these up, you'd be a little short of the total population in the chart above. But if you were to add all those up and then add the folks who are in and out in less than a day, then you would get to the total number.
And then my other question would be, it looks to me from your synopsis that there seems to be an increase in violent crime. Can you quantify that numerically? Because it's a little more difficult with regard to the just boxes.
Yeah, so I want to should want to back up a little bit and be careful. So this is admissions into the jail for violent offenses. I think I want to be a little hesitant and say that this is directly tied to an increase in violent crime. Certainly it may be, but most of the folks that come into the detention facility might have multiple charges at any one time. So what this graphic does is try and establish what is the most serious offense that we're seeing on an admission. And so in terms of most serious offense, we're seeing a little more violent crimes than say we did in 2019 in terms of our admissions. I don't have the raw number in front of me, but what we can do is sort of look at what's happening with our bookings per month over this time, specifically for violent crime. So we're talking about 20 to 30 admissions per month for the most serious offense, based on how I've coded it and some decisions I had to make per month. We can see that certainly in April, we're right at about what we saw in 2019. We see a little bit of increase in 2019 in May and June, but certainly the increases that we've seen this year are higher than what we saw last year on the magnitude of 5 to 10 more bookings per month.
So thank you for the clarifications. Are there other questions? It looks like Julie Merritt may have a question. Julie, would you like to go?
Yeah. Hi, Julie Merritt, from the City Council. I just wanted to say that before Quinn changed the parameter of what we were looking at on this slide, what it was showing us was percentages, which doesn't necessarily mean that there was more violent crime. It just meant that a greater percentage of the people who were booked into the jail were being booked for violent crimes. Is that true, Quinn?
Yes, Julie, thank you for that's a perfect clarification. Yes, you're exactly right. These two bottom visualizations here, it's the share of the population. So the relative share of folks in on a violent crime is higher in Q2 of 2020 than it was in Q2 of 2019. But yes, to Julie's clarification, that doesn't necessarily mean the raw number is. Though I will say from the graphic I just showed you where we filtered specifically for violent crimes, we do see bookings in May and June are in fact higher than they were in 2019 in terms of the pure nominal number.
As a quick follow-up, Judge Halligan, I would be interested to look at that over a longer period of time. That's a pretty short snapshot to just look at one quarter and, from 2 different years. I'm not sure if that tells us, I mean, it's information, but as far as trends, I'm not sure it tells us what the trend is.
We'll all hope it trends down no matter what the trend is. But I do appreciate the follow-up and the kind of clarification. Well, Quinn, I don't see other hands up for questions. Perhaps we'll turn it over to Tom.
Yeah.
So he can kind of do his presentation, and then perhaps there'll be more questions again from folks and CJCC members. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tom Eberly from the Justice Management Institute. I'm the program director. JMI is a nonprofit agency based out of Arlington, Virginia, and we are a site coordinating agency for Missoula County as part of your Safety and Justice Challenge involvement through the MacArthur Foundation. And I just really want to thank everyone for the opportunity today to share some information that we've put together regarding your jail population. Julie, if you wouldn't mind. Kristen, sorry. So Missoula County and the Safety and Justice Challenge started several years ago when you became an innovation site. More recently in 2018, you were actually awarded a $700,000 grant over a 2-year period to become an implementation site. Difference between an innovation site and an implementation site is really a lot of money difference, as well as just the expectations for an implementation site are much greater because you are given a direct number to reduce your jail population by. When the county accepted the grant from the MacArthur Foundation, it made a commitment to the foundation to safely reduce your jail population and to address racial and ethnic disparities in the criminal justice system. You put together several strategies, and some of those strategies are already in place. Others are in progress. Strategies include the implementation of the PSA and the launching of the Calibrate program in the District Attorney's Office as examples. And as I mentioned, the grant covers a 2-year period, and that grant will expire on December 31st of this year. Next slide, please. So when the foundation picked you as an implementation site, they did an analysis of your jail population and said that you need to reduce your population by 18% based on national averages of what they see a jurisdiction your size having in terms of number of people in jail. And then they also formulated a baseline, which is probably about I think 6 or 12 months before you actually became a member of the Safety and Justice Challenge. And so that was 182 inmates with the 18% reduction goal. What they're asking you to do is get down to 149 inmates. Prior to COVID, your average jail population in February was hanging around 189 inmates, which puts you above the baseline. With COVID and all the changes that Quinn actually just outlined, your population has dropped considerably. For a while there, you're almost 50% less. But since then, it's crept up, like Quinn mentioned. And at the end of June, you're about 25% below your baseline. And so while that's good in terms of the SJC, the trends that Quinn pointed out are troublesome. And really, I mean, COVID wasn't one of your strategies. So while it was somewhat beneficial in that regard, in terms of meeting your goal, it's not sustainable likely in the long run. Next slide, please. So with the grant renewal, I just want to let you know that the grant renewal is due to the foundation by September 25th, 2020. You can expect flat-line funding from the foundation, which is pretty standard across all the cohort sites that you belong to. There is a chance that you could get less money than you received initially. There's two caveats for that would cause that to occur. The first is that you have not made progress, not you specifically, but you in general. If a site has not made progress in implementing their strategies, in lowering their jail population, and addressing racial and ethnic disparities, if there are no indicators that you're making success, the foundation could offer less funding. The second thing is if you're not successfully spending your grant down that you were given the first time, and if you're not spending the money, the foundation sees that as you not needing the money. So it's very important that you spend the funds that you have before the end of this grant cycle. So just want to make you aware of that, and also let you know that the grant award, when it's submitted by you all, you'll get a response by the early part of December. And what the foundation also is asking for the sites to do that are submitting renewal applications is to revisit your strategies and figure out if you should revise those strategies to get where you need to be, or if you should augment those by maybe trying some new things, whatever it takes to reach the jail reduction goals that you have, as well as the racial equity goals that you have. So to assist you in thinking about your renewal application, JMI put together some data. We conducted 2 different types of analyses that are recommended by the National Institute of Corrections. The first analysis is a tracking analysis that looks at individuals released from jail. And the second is a snapshot analysis that looks at individuals detained in your jail at a specific moment in time. The tracking analysis shows the non-static nature of the jail population. It shows who comes and goes into your jail. The tracking analysis often shows how low-level charges quickly enter and leave the jail. These are people that are circulating in and out. Usually they appear in the tracking analysis. Compared to the tracking analysis, the snapshot analysis, on the other hand, captures who stays in your jail. The tracking analysis often shows the most serious offenders who stay in jail for the longest period of time. Excuse me, the snapshot analysis often shows the most serious offenders who stay in your jail for the longest periods of time. Knowing that the tracking analysis shows who comes and goes while the snapshot shows who stays, it's often interesting to compare the 2 analyses side by side. Because of COVID, JMI conducted a tracking analysis and a snapshot analysis before the outbreak and one after the outbreak to see any kind of differences that may have occurred because of that event. Before I share the data with you, I just want to make sure I share with you some of the limitations of the data itself. One is that only the most serious charge was tracked. The second is that the data is only useful and accurate as the information that was put into your jail record management system. There's nothing we could do to correct any data entry errors that were made or any limitations that may exist in your record management system. The third thing that is somewhat of a limitation is that the data is intended to be presented at a very high level of what's going on in your jail population. And as a result, the data really doesn't explain why things are changing in your jail population. For example, the data shows an increase in the average length of stay over and over again in the tables that I'm going to be sharing with you before and after COVID. The data can't explain why that occurred. To answer that type of question, it comes back to you all and having conversations about what you think may have caused that and maybe even further analysis on what needs to be done to understand that problem. And really that was the point of this analysis, is just to generate some information for the county to use to have discussions and explore what you want to include in your SJC renewal grant application. Next slide, please. So let's jump into the data and look at some of the tables that were put together from the analysis. You can see we have a chart for the snapshot and a chart for the tracking. The tracking data was pulled from the last 2 weeks of February and the first 2 weeks of June. The snapshot was taken on March 3rd and June 16th. The number of individuals in both the tracking and the snapshots were much lower after COVID. For example, you can see in the tracking table there that we had 168 individuals leaving the jail during that 2-week period, and only 68 individuals during that 2-week period during the first part of June. So it shows you how the volume has really changed because of COVID. Looking at the tracking and the snapshot analyses, most of the people coming through the jails were male, white, and residents of Missoula County. The numbers highlighted in yellow show the proportion of women released after COVID was greater. For example, you can see it went from 25% to 33.8% of females were released. And this is very similar to the conversation that we just had with Julie and Quinn about proportions rather than whole numbers. And so you can see one of the effects of that was when you look at the snapshot, those who stay in the jail, you can see that the male population really increased quite a bit, while the female population decreased. The numbers highlighted in light blue on the snapshot table illustrate how the length of stay increased quite a bit for those in jail post-COVID. Again, the analysis doesn't tell exactly why, but in later tables, we will see that the composition of the jail population changed and there were more serious offenders being detained in the jail after COVID, and along the lines again of what Quinn just talked about, the jail population kind of hardening a little bit as the population shrunk and the less serious offenders looked like they were let go from the facility. Another noteworthy change that was observed in the data was that, as highlighted in the green, was that the proportion of people of color in the jail increased slightly after the outbreak of COVID. Next slide, please. This slide looks at specific charges in the jail, both tracking and snapshot. Highlighted in yellow in the tracking table are the 3 most common categories of offenses released from jail prior to COVID. The top 3 offense categories were, based on proportions, were public order, DUI, and failure to appear. After COVID, it changed. The most common charges released from jail were domestic violence, drug offenses, and failure to appear. Keeping in mind that the snapshot shows who tends to remain locked up, the 3 most common charges based on proportions were drug offenses, failure to appear, and property offenses prior to COVID. After the outbreak, drug offenses were still the most common to remain in the jail in the snapshot, followed by failure to appears and those charged with violent offenses. Probation violations, parole violations, pretrial release violations, failure to appears, and revocations of suspended sentences are highlighted in green because I really wanted to bring to your attention that these 5 things together appear to significantly impact the numbers of people in your jail population. These are things that could potentially be reduced to help lower your jail population as part of the Safety and Justice Challenge. And then lastly, on those 2 tables, I just want to highlight the area in red, which talks about the average length of stay, simply to draw to your attention how the average length of stay is pretty much increasing across the board in both the snapshot and the tracking analyses before and after COVID. Some offense categories are increasing more than others, as you can see in the tables here. Next, please. On this slide, we're looking at charge information. In the tracking analysis, most of the volume of cases are misdemeanors, and most of the cases are from the municipal and justice courts. Most of the individuals who enter the jail on a new arrest or warrant arrest during the tracking, it can be seen in this table. And only 6.5% were actually committed to the jail, meaning that they were either sentenced to the jail, to DOC, or some other facility. In contrast, when you look at the snapshot analysis, most of the cases, proportionally speaking, were felony and out of the district court before and after COVID. The data highlighted in yellow shows how felony and district court cases increased in the data after COVID. The highlighted information in green shows how the proportion of commitments to jail decreased after the COVID outbreak. So you can really see here, for example, under commitments, how in the tracking, there was 6.5% commitments. By early June, there was hardly anyone in the tracking, there was no one in the tracking analysis coming out of the jail due to a commitment. And you can also see in the snapshot how commitments also were essentially cut in half, proportionally speaking. So across the board, for the most part, you can see how the average length of stay increased again in these tables. It doesn't matter how we slice or dice the data, the average length of stay is increasing in almost every category. Next slide, please. The jail information one, please. In both the tracking and the snapshot, most of the individuals were detained on pretrial status, as you can see here. In the tracking analysis, the proportion of inmates released during the pretrial increased by 12%. As a result, in the snapshot analysis, you can see that the percentage of inmates detained in the pretrial decreased. So you had in the tracking a bump in pretrial people leaving the jail, but then you can see the same effect in the snapshot, which shows that correlation between the 2 analyses. The green here highlights in the proportion of individuals who were released on bond, own recognizance, and released to pretrial services. I thought this was interesting because it goes hand in hand with what we saw up above in the area that was highlighted in yellow in terms of the number of or proportion of people being released on pretrial status was due to more people obviously getting out on those three things I just mentioned. And it was quite sizable when you compare what happened from February to May, June. You can see that those released on own recognizance almost doubled proportionally between those two time periods. I also want to highlight on these two tables what you see in purple, and those are inmates detained in the jail, in part because of a probation or parole detainer. Roughly more than a third of the individuals coming through the jail or detained in jail have a detainer, and the most common detainers are for probation and parole holds. And so that's just an area where I think there's an opportunity to kind of figure out why those folks are kind of sticking in your jail population. And then finally, in looking at the snapshot table, I want to draw your attention to the classification level of the inmate population. This is interesting because you can see in the blue highlight how the jail population became more of a higher risk as the jail population shrunk due to actions taken by the criminal justice system in response to COVID. It went from 41.4% to 55.8% high risk. And in turn, you can see that the minimum risk inmates classified, that is, went from 16.1 to 7.8%. So about half of the minimum secure inmates were released. So moving on to the next slide on the average length of stay. To kind of wrap up the analysis, I wanted to share with you how the two tables reflect how the average length of stay has really just changed considerably over the past few months. When you look at the tracking, you can see, for example, that the individual staying less than 1 day was 38.1%, and then it declined to 22.1%. And if you look at toward the bottom of that same chart, you can see that individuals staying 31 days or more is up to 20.6% after COVID. And of course, that's reflected in your overall average length of stay, as it went up by about 3 weeks, just based on the tracking analysis. In the snapshot analysis, you see that almost the same thing. There are less people in the jail staying less than 1 to 7 days. And on the flip side, you see more individuals staying 90 days or more in your facility. And subsequently, in this particular analysis, we also saw a spike in the length of stay as it went from 61 days on average before COVID in March to 100 days after COVID. So next slide, please. The information in the analysis suggests there are several areas that Missoula County can explore in reducing their jail population to strengthen your renewal application and really meet the goals of the SJC. I've outlined some of those areas in this particular slide for areas that we can explore together. One is to figure out ways to reduce the probation and parole violations. There's so many different ways you could tackle that through the increased use of non-incarceration sanctions, for example. The other thing that we can look at is reducing the time to process probation violations, and even the amount of time that the probation detainer is held on a person that's held in your jail. A second thing that we can look at is improving the success of pretrial release and suspended sentences. As I showed you in the data, there's quite a few people that come into your jail after failing to succeed on on pretrial release. And the same thing can be said for those that were released on a suspended sentence. Further analysis is obviously needed to figure out why they're not making it. But if we can somehow shorten up and improve the likelihood that they'll succeed, I think we'll have a lot more success in lowering your jail population. The third thing that we should probably explore in terms of improving your application and lowering your jail population is lowering the court failure to appears and increasing the court appearance rates. What we're seeing is that you just have a large number of people coming back in your jail because they are not showing up for court. And there's a lot of research in this area showing ways that you can increase the appearance rate for defendants so that they don't get a warrant issued and then come back to your facility. The fourth thing is to proactively address the backlog of criminal cases due to COVID. Quinn touched on this just a little bit earlier, but there is a strong concern about how this backlog of criminal cases is going to affect your jail population in the long run. There's jurisdictions across the country right now that are increasing the use of video technology, increasing the use of diversion, increasing the use of mediation where the defense and the prosecutor sit down prior to any court hearing and try to come up with a solution that they can present to the court rather than waiting to that specific court event to take place. One other area is to continue the expanded use of non-financial pretrial release. As we saw in the data earlier, there's quite a bit of an increase in releases on own recognizance. If that's not proving to be detrimental to the operations of the court, that's something we should definitely consider continuing after COVID slows down a little bit, hopefully, and especially even now as COVID's picking up, and we're still not certain what the future is going to hold for all this. And then lastly, the one other area that really should be considered based on the data that I'm sharing with you is exploring the disproportionality of natives in your jail. Compared to your general population, the native population is very much overrepresented in your jail. And in some instances,
So Tom, I don't know if you can.
population.
Great. So unfortunately, you froze the very last part of your statement. And so we did hear that we have an overrepresentation of our native population, but we didn't hear the last little bit. Do you mind repeating it?
I apologize. My internet's giving me problems. Said there's overrepresentation of the native population in the jail compared to the general population. And then as a whole, I feel like there's opportunities based on the data that we're seeing. Like I said, it doesn't explain why this is all occurring, but it does suggest that there's room for conversation and to explore these areas and come back together as a group and talk them through and figure out ways that we could possibly do better in addressing things that are potentially driving your jail population. And in doing so, we can get your jail population down to the goal that the foundation set.
Well, Tom, thank you very much for the review. Obviously, it's interesting to see what's going on. Certainly, as a judge, I've seen, I guess, some issues that I think might form a basis for some of the delay. But I think with the information, we can at least hopefully identify more long-term what programmatic things or policy things need to change to try to expedite some of that. I'm wondering if people have questions for you. And so if you have a question, if you'd click the little raise hand, which is in the participant box, hopefully you've seen it. And if you don't see a raise hand, if you'd like to just interject as long as someone else isn't speaking. So I don't see questions. Kristen, do you have any thoughts given, I guess, what you've been reviewing with regard to priorities on our new grant or the grant application?
Yeah, thank you. I've left the slide up because I think it is a really good talking point synopsis of what we could think about in putting in our grant. Our current grant has fallen really short in addressing ethnic and racial disparities. So making sure that our new grant really has a focus on that, whatever they may be, is really important. And I think we've all seen different views of the same thing, in that we're seeing a lot of violations, petitions to revoke, pretrial failures, which would be a really interesting thing to take a deeper dive into and see if there's something we couldn't do in that space to put into our grant as well. Thank you.
Sure. Susan, I see that you have your hand up. Do you have a thought or a question?
Yes, I was wondering if there's been any progress on eliminating bonds, meaning keeping people that are truly a danger to the community and not having anyone else post a bond, so that you'd eliminate that bail. I noticed that was one of the things in the, just exploring, continuing the expanded use of non-financial pretrial release. So I know we talked about that in one of our face-to-face meetings. That was one of the things that came up. So
I don't think that we have done anything as drastic as states like New Jersey, where they've completely eliminated bond. But I do note that some of the research that Tom had done, and probably didn't have a chance to review all of it, he's put together kind of a 10-page document that summarizes some of what he presented today, indicates that the bond has gone down on average from $25,000 to $15,000 for felony offenses. So there has been, I guess, a trend downward with regard to the amount of bond. Certainly we have some very serious allegations for individuals, and some of those bonds are quite high, but on average, the average has gone down. And then I don't know if it's as accurately reflected because of the snapshot information, but I noted that there were more releases to pretrial supervision or these OR releases on their own recognizance. So I don't know if we've been able to kind of discern all of those OR releases, but in my experience, I think that we've actually done more releases OR to then pretrial supervision, and I don't know if how we're explaining it in court is getting as accurately reflected. My sense would be that there are perhaps more pretrial supervision releases that may have been listed as OR releases, but I do think there's somewhat of a trend toward releasing folks without the posting of financial bond, as long as they're qualified or there's no serious concerns about safety, and pretrial supervision is able to engage them.
thanks, Leslie.
Other questions?
Hey, Laurel, if you're on, go ahead and ask your question outright. That's fine. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just wondering if Tom and Quinn, if you could address not only the more recent increase in the number of Native folks who are in our jail at the moment, but overall since we got the grant originally, and what increase we've seen since then.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know, Tom, if you want to add it. Tom focused on this a bit more. We do have some racial and ethnic disparity data that we're able to look at, and I think just certainly what we've seen, as Tom mentioned, that is sort of over the life of our grant and likely beforehand, before we started doing this sort of tracking, certainly our Native population is overrepresented in our jail relative to our general population. I want to say for our general population, for folks that identify as Native, we're talking approximately 3.5 to 4.5%, depending on sort of what census data you look at and what year you're looking at. Whereas we're talking 20+% of the population at the detention center identifying as Native. Now, certainly that is a large disparity between who is in our jail and who is in our community. I think there are some reasons we certainly need to explore behind why that disparity exists and why it's so large. Unfortunately, I really don't have the answers to that question at this time. I think that's going to take some in-depth work to understand what are the drivers of that disparity and where we might be able to find some solutions. But certainly, I think it's important to acknowledge that in terms of people of color represented in our jail, that is certainly a glaring disparity.
Yeah, I just looked it up on the jail dashboard that Quinn put together on Missoula County's website that depicts a lot of this data, and just in the bottom sort of area that it explains and provides context for the jail dashboard, I think it says that between November 2017 and October 2019, the average population for Native folks in the jail was 17.2. So that's kind of the number I was looking for, that I wanted to share with folks in case that hadn't been mentioned, compared to the more in the 20s percentage that we're at now. Thanks, Quinn.
And I just want to add that I think Quinn's absolutely right. And I think there's a chance that we could take the data set that was provided to us and do some crosstabs with the Native population and see, how they compare in terms of the types of charges that they're facing and the level of the charge, and see if there's a little bit of a difference there.
So Tom, I was just going to say that for those of us that practice kind of in the criminal justice system, I think we're well aware of the overrepresentation at all levels, probably arrest, detention, prison. It's I think an well-established problem. And so I'm wondering, you had mentioned that you might have some thoughts about how to kind of explore that and what interventions we could do to try to eliminate that. I'm wondering if you might have some ideas for us to think about as we kind of address that issue.
Well, it's nothing magical. There's organizations that are part of the Safety and Justice Challenge that have really a strong understanding of the Native community and, more importantly, community engagement. And it really does involve opening dialogue between the two communities and building a lot of trust and following through on promises that are made. And so there are organizations through the Safety and Justice Challenge that we can definitely bring in to work with you all. And it will, I promise you, it'll be unique to your county in the sense that you have to think that, the natives that live in your jurisdiction are very different than whatever has been occurring in New Orleans or even Lewis and Clark or wherever. So we just have to treat each situation as what it is. It's unique.
And I don't want to divert too many to other, problems. And so if there's questions, feel free to raise your hand and I'm happy to call on you. But you had also mentioned that kind of our probation violations of pretrial supervision, kind of these violations of kind of existing court orders. There's a fair percentage of folks in jail for exceedingly longer periods of time. And you mentioned that there might also be some interventions or strategies that would be helpful. So I wondered if you wouldn't mind addressing that a little bit more in detail.
Sure. Well, probation is one area. I mean, you just see jurisdictions across the country that are developing more internal sanctions. And maybe you already have this, and I apologize. But they're creating internal sanctions that they will try to bring the person back in line with the requirements that have been placed on them by the court, rather than actually involving the court, maybe having a warrant issued. And really, you achieve the same result a lot of time. You get the person performing better, and it doesn't involve anyone being locked up. I also mentioned the fact that in some jurisdictions, when a detainer is issued, that those detainers are reviewed within X number of days by the probation officer, and making sure that the detainer is something that they want to keep in place on this individual. For example, if someone gets arrested on a low-level offense, does that person really need to have that detainer, which might keep them in jail for a very long time? Maybe they can just be released and the person come back to probation until their low-level charge is taken care of. Other jurisdictions have put on caps in terms of how quickly they will address the probation violation, and will do so within 14 days, for example. Obviously, if there's a pending charge, that makes it a little bit more difficult. But the judge who is overseeing the case that has a probation violation will then reassess whether or not the person should be kept in jail pending the outcome of that other case. So that's one thing. When it comes to failure to appear, there's a lot of things being done across the country to minimize those. Everything from court reminders, text messages. There's new apps that you can put on your phone that will alert people as well. Letters being sent, although they're less successful. You even have probation staff calling people and reminding them of their court events, and even offering to provide transportation through bus passes or even, Uber lifts or whatever. And if they are talking to the person, they may also identify the fact that, maybe they're sick or they're in jail somewhere else, and share that information with the court to kind of circumvent the issuing of a warrant for failure to appear. With the revocation of suspended sentence, that really requires a little bit more of an investigation in terms of your local practices. But let's look into why that's happening at a fairly significant rate. Is it because someone's getting rearrested? If it is because someone's getting rearrested, does it make a difference if it's for a felony versus a misdemeanor? And if it does, how can we maybe approach how we revoke those sentences a little bit differently? And then when it comes to the pretrial release and people failing that, is it because they didn't show up for court, or is it because they got a new offense? Two different things. Let's examine why those things may be an impact on the failure rate for the program, and see if there are things that we can do to kind of shore that up.
And so in the review that you and perhaps that Quinn is doing right now, are we kind of drilling down in the data to see if in fact some of those probation violations are based on a new offense? Or is that a step we could take?
That's a step we could take. I mean, the data that we shared with you is just more along the lines of, something sticking out that, that says, why don't we take a look at that and figure out what's causing that? Because, just a small change in that one area could reduce your jail population 5 to 10 inmates, and you're getting very close to meeting your goal.
So just, I guess, for education of other folks that are on the call, our probation and parole department has developed some best practices that are fairly innovative, and I think do establish sanction grids that try to address interventions sooner than later to try to prevent people from returning back to detention. What I often see are people just essentially kind of falling off with regard to supervision and not being able to be located. And so obviously those are things that I don't know if that's perhaps strategic. They've engaged in something, they know they're in trouble, so they're just not going to make any contact. Certainly, I think that happens, but it would be good to collaborate, I think, with Department of Corrections on some of those issues. So if we do need to intervene, or they need court intervention or some other type of intervention sooner than later, that it's not just a siloed approach to how to deal with folks that are failing their probation or having difficulty managing.
And then the beauty of Judge about what we're talking about is that they really don't have a price tag on them usually. It's maybe a policy change. It's maybe doing something a little bit faster than we did before. Or it might just involve training with folks and making them more cognizant about the messaging that they share with people when they're placed on probation, and relationship building with that probationer, so that they feel more responsible to the probation officer and the courts.
And then lastly, I see some questions with regard to kind of mental health assessments and individuals that may be suffering from some type of either undiagnosed or diagnosed mental health condition that may have precipitated their arrest or their engagement in some alleged criminal behavior. I didn't know if any of our data was really drilling down to gather that information, or if that was also an area we might want to focus on.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to add for the folks in the chat asking about mental health data and just sort of drilling down in general. Certainly what Tom and I presented today is sort of more high level data that we're able to extract from the detention center's record management system fairly easily and quickly. I think certainly anyone that works in the criminal justice space can understand how complex some of these cases can be, and how complex a defendant's situation may be. So I just want to put out there that sort of as we drill down more, it requires an even higher sort of level of attention to detail, and in many cases requires manually looking at these cases on a case-by-case basis to really get at some of the issues that folks are curious about and folks are asking about. So it's certainly possible, certainly an area that we could go into and explore more. I think it just requires a bit more effort than sort of these high level statistical or quantitative aggregate analysis that you saw today.
And so an ideal outcome from the information that Quinn and I are sharing with you today is if there were maybe a couple groups formed around specific areas, and we kind of talk through with them what they're seeing in the field and what they know intuitively as possible areas to explore better ways of doing business. This thing about the mental health keeps popping up on the chat room, and it would be nice to hear from these folks and hear what they're seeing and how everything connects, and potentially put together a strategy that would address those concerns and hopefully reduce your jail population.
And then I guess the last point that I'll bring up, Laurel, you have a question. Why don't you go first and then I'll follow up.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could just flip back to the slide with the demographics. I was wondering if there was a specific racial or ethnic group that made up the majority of that remaining other percent. Let's see here. Yeah, so the non-white, that 6%, and well, then up to 9.3. I was just wondering if there was a group what does that encapsulate, and if one racial or ethnic group made up the bulk of that percentage?
It was a a little bit of everything, quite honestly. You had Black, you had Pacific Islanders, and a couple others, Asian, for example. But of the groups I mentioned, Black and Pacific Islanders probably made up the larger part of the 6%.
Thank you.
And Tom and Quinn, the last question I was going to ask is trying to figure out if in fact the kind of the delays in jury trials and kind of just hearings in general because of the COVID restrictions. So in Missoula, we have primarily been operating through the entire period of COVID. Some jurisdictions kind of took a hiatus and really weren't doing any hearings. Certainly there's probably been, there was probably a month or so where there were fewer hearings than normal. But I would say that since April or so, the judges here have primarily been doing hearings routinely, but for some of the jury trials, because the complications related to social distancing, space, masking, and all of those things for public health. So I just wondered with regard to average length of stay, which of course I'm concerned about the near doubling in lots of different categories. I'm wondering if there's a way to determine what effect the COVID kind of procedures have had on that average length of stay.
Yeah, I will say that, Judge, like that is a particularly complex question. I think we have a lot of, or at least a few significant things contributing to why we're seeing an increase in length of stay. So again, I'd sort of give an answer that I gave previously, is I think it's definitely possible, but I think when we're talking about that level of data, it would require sort of a case-by-case review. I think anecdotally what we saw is during certainly that initial stages of COVID back in late March and early April, certainly case continuances, just anecdotally seeing more of those. But I think whether or not case continuance was put in for, specifically in response to COVID issues and COVID procedures versus that's just what needed to happen at the case at that time, I think that's going to require a close examination of the court record. So again, it's something that's possible, but certainly labor intensive to get to that level of detail. But at the same time, I acknowledge that that's an important issue, because I think we have a couple different things going on as to why our length of stay is increasing, and I think it's important to acknowledge that as you interpret this data.
All right. Laurel, do you have another question? Any other questions or comments? So Kristen, would you like to, I guess, provide any closing statements kind of with regard to where you're at in the grant application? So at least CJCC members, if they have ideas about focal points, they could get back to you within a timely kind of basis.
Yeah, so we are in the process of collecting ideas from various places. So this was another one of those various places where we're trying to collect strategy ideas. And once we tap into a few other communities, I'd like to put all the suggested ideas together, and then perhaps make sure that they've got some costs related to them as well, and do a voting process if it kind of all doesn't fit into our grant ask with our CJCC and our greater Missoula County community, perhaps via Facebook or some type of social media survey tool. So yeah, we're still collecting ideas, and then would like to just get them all formulated and then go back and ask people which ones they like the best.
All right. And so I know, as I said, there are many folks who might be from the community that aren't CJCC members, but obviously if you have an interest in any of the areas, feel free to reach out to Kristen and let us know If you have an interest in working on a subgroup, or if you have some good ideas or concerns about any of the information that was presented. And I guess I'll just say, if there's any last questions, feel free to jump in. And if not, thank you all very much for your participation. The information that Tom had presented and the slides, I believe, will be available. And so if you'd like to review them, that would be great as well.
I might add one thing. We're planning a this exact presentation to City Council, and we probably will do a variation of it at our next CJCC as well, just to make sure that we get it out there. This has been recorded, and I'll share it on social media as well. So.
Well, thank you, Tom and Quinn, very much for your efforts and for the hard work and analyzing the information. Tom, do you have any last closing remarks, or Quinn?
No, just thanks everyone for joining, and please don't hesitate to reach out to me with questions or comments or other things that you're interested in seeing. We're always looking for new areas to explore, and or just new information that can help add some context to some of the numbers that we're seeing. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We'll be adjourned.